There's something surreal about returning home earlier than expected. The military transport plane touched down with a jarring thud, and as the engines roared to a stop, I finally allowed myself a moment of relief. 2 weeks ahead of schedule. 2 weeks closer to home. I was ready to see Elena and Liam, to breathe in the scent of my own house, and to hear my son's laughter bounce off the walls. The air at the base felt oddly quiet. No distant explosions. No urgent chatter over radios. Just an eerie stillness that left me unsettled. My body, still wired from years of combat, refused to relax. Every muscle was taut, every instinct on edge. It wasn't combat readiness. It was something else. Something closer to unease. I boarded the cab that would take me back to the suburbs. The driver, a quiet man with kind eyes, seemed to sense my mood. He didn't press me with questions about my uniform or deployment. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the engine filling the silence. As we drove, the familiar streets began to unfurl before me. The coffee shop Elena loved, now remodeled. Liam's school with a new coat of paint and a bigger playground. Everything looked the same, yet not quite right. There were subtle changes, like time had moved on without waiting for me. But that was fine, wasn't it? Life doesn't freeze for a man on deployment. Elena and Liam had probably adjusted to their own rhythms in my absence. I'd come back and blend into those rhythms again. I'd make up for the birthdays and milestones I'd missed. At least that's what I kept telling myself. When the cab turned onto my street, I leaned forward, eager to spot the colonial-style house that had been my anchor for years. I'd replayed this moment in my head 1,000 times. Liam running into my arms, Elena's surprise turning into tears of joy. It was a picture-perfect scene in my mind. Reality, however, wasn't quite so picturesque. The first thing I noticed was the garden. Gone were Elena's beloved hydrangeas, the ones she'd spent years perfecting. In their place were generic shrubs, planted in neat rows like soldiers on parade. It was strange. Those flowers were practically her identity. Why would she replace them? Then the house itself. It was spotless, pristine even, but it looked empty, like it had been scrubbed clean of its soul. No toys scattered on the lawn. No sign of Liam's bike leaning against the porch. The curtains were drawn tight, hiding whatever was inside. As the cab rolled to a stop, Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor, stepped out onto her porch. She froze when she saw me, her expression flickering between shock and something that looked suspiciously like pity. Pity? For me? She opened her mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Without a word, she turned and hurried back inside, her door slamming shut. I paid the driver, shouldered my duffel bag, and stood there for a moment, staring at the house. My house. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like I was about to walk into enemy territory. Still, I pressed forward. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, the familiar click of the tumblers offering a brief flash of comfort. But the moment I pushed the door open, that comfort vanished. The first thing that hit me was the smell, or rather, the lack of it. Elena's vanilla-scented candles, the ones she lit every evening, were missing. In their place was a sterile, almost clinical emptiness. The walls, once covered in photos of our family, were bare. The furniture was there, but it looked untouched, like a showroom instead of a living space. "Nathan? Elena?" I called out, my voice echoing through the silence. No answer. I walked through the house, my combat-trained senses picking up every detail. The slight scuff marks on the hardwood floor where Liam used to race his toy cars were faded. The kitchen counters, once cluttered with Elena's baking experiments, were spotless. It wasn't just that the house looked different. It felt different. Cold, impersonal, like a place waiting for someone else to move in. The only thing that looked lived in was the pile of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Bills, magazines, a few envelopes addressed to Elena. My name was conspicuously absent. I dropped my duffel bag near the stairs and stared at the emptiness around me. My instincts, honed over years of survival in hostile environments, screamed that something was wrong. But what? I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting for me in this house wasn't the homecoming I had dreamed of. Something was off, and I was going to find out what. I hadn't expected my son, Liam, to be the one who would shatter my world. The house felt so alien, so devoid of life, that I barely had time to process it before I heard the thundering of small feet. Then there he was. Liam flying down the stairs with a speed that could rival any sprinter. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Before I could react, he threw himself at me, nearly knocking me off balance. His arms wrapped around my neck in a grip so tight, I wondered if he thought I'd disappear if he let go. "Hey, buddy," I managed, my voice thick. I dropped my duffel and crouched to his level, pulling him into a proper hug. God, he felt so small, so fragile in my arms. His hair smelled faintly of the shampoo Elena used to buy. Coconut, maybe? I wasn't sure anymore. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I knew you would." "I missed you so much," I said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. His cheeks were thinner, his eyes older, too old for an 8-year-old. There was a wariness in his gaze that hadn't been there before I left. "What's wrong, Liam?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he bit his lip and looked away like he was debating whether or not to tell me something. That's when I noticed his hands. They were gripping my uniform like a lifeline, his little fingers curled into the fabric with an intensity that made my heart ache. "It's okay," I said gently. "You can tell me anything. I'm here now." He hesitated for a moment longer before blurting out, "Mom's at church." "Church?" I repeated, confused. It wasn't Sunday. Elena wasn't particularly religious either. She's getting married," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, the words not registering at first. My mind refused to process what I'd just heard. "Married?" I echoed, as though saying it out loud would make it make sense. "To Uncle Mark," Liam continued, his words tumbling out now. "They're all there. Grandma, Grandpa, Aunt Lucy." He trailed off, watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction. For a moment, the world tilted. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though I'd stepped onto a battlefield riddled with hidden traps. I had to lock my knees to keep from staggering. Uncle Mark, my best friend, my supposed brother-in-arms, the man I trusted to watch over my family while I was gone. I felt a cold rage begin to simmer in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm for Liam's sake. "Tell me everything, buddy," I said, keeping my voice steady. "When did this start?" Liam's brow furrowed as he tried to piece it together. "Uncle Mark started coming over a lot after you left. At first it was just for dinner. Then he started sleeping on the couch sometimes. Mom said it was because he was lonely." My hands clenched into fists, but I kept my tone measured. "And when did they—" "A few months ago," Liam said, his voice cracking. "I heard them talking late at night. They didn't know I was awake. They said you chose the military over us, that you didn't want to come home." My heart broke as I saw the tears welling up in his eyes. "But I didn't believe them," he added quickly, his voice rising in desperation. "I remembered what you told me before you left, that you were protecting us, that you loved us." I pulled him into another hug, letting him cry into my shoulder. My mind raced with every word he'd said, piecing together the puzzle. Mark hadn't just betrayed me. He'd inserted himself into my life, stolen my family, and manipulated my son. The sheer audacity of it burned like a fresh wound. "I never stopped loving you," I whispered to Liam. Don't you ever doubt that. He nodded against my shoulder, his small body trembling. But the more he told me, the more I realized the depth of their betrayal. The photos of me that had disappeared from the walls, the roses in the garden replaced with shrubs, the silence in the house that used to be filled with laughter. All of it had been intentional, a slow erasure of my existence. Do you want to go to the church? I asked him, my voice tight. Or would you rather stay here? Liam pulled back and looked at me, his face set with determination. I'm coming with you, Dad. I want to see their faces when they realize you're home. God, I was proud of him. My son, my brave little warrior. Then let's go, I said, my voice low and steady. It's time to remind them what loyalty really means. I stood, taking his hand in mine. The house didn't feel like a home anymore, but that didn't matter. I wasn't staying here. I was going to face this betrayal head on. As we stepped outside, the sun seemed too bright, the air too clean. It felt wrong, like the world should have reflected the storm inside me. But I wasn't about to let that storm consume me. I had a mission now, and I wasn't going to fail. Driving to the church felt like a mission. The kind of mission where you didn't know exactly what you'd find, but you knew it wouldn't be good. Liam sat beside me, his small hand gripping mine tightly as I navigated the familiar streets. My jaw clenched each time we passed another landmark tied to my family's life. Our life. A life that apparently no longer existed. The radio played some light pop song, but I barely heard it. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Mark and Elena. My best friend and my wife. It sounded absurd even in my head, like a bad soap opera plot, but the evidence Liam had shared was impossible to ignore. Dad? Liam's voice broke through my thoughts. Yeah, buddy? Are you mad? I glanced at him. His face was so serious, so full of worry that it tugged at something deep in my chest. Not at you, I said firmly. Never at you. But at Mom and Uncle Mark? I didn't answer immediately. How could I explain the storm of emotions churning inside me? The betrayal, the anger, the hurt, the sheer disbelief? I'm upset, Liam, I said finally. But right now, I'm focused on making things right. He nodded solemnly, like he understood far more than an 8-year-old should. The church came into view, a picturesque building with tall white spires and stained glass windows. The parking lot was packed, filled with cars I recognized all too well. My parents' SUV, Mark's flashy black sedan, Elena's favorite little hatchback. I parked at the far end of the lot, out of sight from the main entrance. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to charge in, to demand answers, to drag Mark out by the collar. But I forced myself to stay calm. Years of military training had drilled one thing into me above all else. Control. Emotional outbursts didn't win battles. Strategy did. I turned to Liam. Stay close to me, all right? He nodded, his face set with determination that mirrored my own. We walked toward the church, the faint sound of the wedding march drifting through the open doors. It felt obscene, like hearing a lullaby in a war zone. My steps were heavy, deliberate, each one a reminder to myself to stay composed. The side door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, the church was a sea of familiar faces. Friends, family, neighbors, every single one of them complicit in this betrayal. They'd all known. They'd all chosen to celebrate this farce instead of standing by me. My eyes landed on the altar, and there she was. Elena, my wife, dressed in a white gown that I knew must have cost a fortune, standing next to Mark. He looked smug, self-assured, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. The organist's fingers froze mid-note as the doors banged open behind me. Every head turned in unison. a wave of gasps and whispers rippling through the congregation. I stepped into the aisle, Liam at my side. My boots echoed against the polished floor as I walked toward them, my gaze locked on Elena and Mark. "Don't let me interrupt," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I just came to congratulate the happy couple." Mark's face turned ashen, his confident smirk vanishing in an instant. Elena's bouquet trembled in her hands, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. "Alex," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Don't," I said sharply. I turned to face the congregation, sweeping my gaze over the sea of familiar faces. Each one seemed to shrink under my scrutiny. "Let's make sure everyone here knows what's really happening," I said, my tone cold and deliberate. "While I was overseas, fighting for this country, my wife and my best friend decided to play house. And now they've decided to make it official, with the blessing of my own family." The whispers grew louder, a nervous energy spreading through the room. "Mark," I said, turning back to him, "you stood beside me in combat. You swore to have my back. And this is how you repay me?" "Alex, listen," Mark began, raising his hands in a placating gesture. But I wasn't listening. My fist connected with his jaw before he could finish the sentence. He stumbled back, clutching his face, blood trickling from his lip. The room erupted into chaos. Elena screamed, dropping her bouquet. My mother rushed forward, her face pale. "Alex, please, don't," I said, cutting her off. "You chose your side. All of you did. Now you'll live with the consequences." I turned back to Elena, who was frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice low and cold. "You betrayed Liam. You betrayed our family, and you'll never be able to undo that." Gripping Liam's hand, I turned and walked back down the aisle, the crowd parting before me like the Red Sea. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their silence said everything. As we stepped outside, the sunlight felt harsh and glaring. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the adrenaline coursing through me. "Are you okay, Dad?" Liam asked quietly. I looked down at him, his young face filled with concern. "I'm fine, buddy," I said, squeezing his hand. "Let's go. We've got work to do." Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. After the spectacle at the church, I didn't go straight home. Driving felt safer than stopping. It kept my mind occupied, my hands busy, and my focus sharp. Liam sat quietly in the back seat, flipping through one of the comic books I'd bought him before my last deployment. He wasn't reading it. His eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, checking on me like he was the parent in this situation. "Where are we going, Dad?" he finally asked, his voice tentative. "To find someone who can help," I replied. My tone was steady, but my grip on the wheel betrayed my tension. I wasn't about to let Mark, Elena, or anyone else think they'd won. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. I'd play smarter. My mind was already calculating, categorizing, planning. If there was one thing the military taught me, it was that no battle is fought alone. You needed allies, intel, and strategy. Right now, I had a lot of questions and not enough answers. An hour later, I pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. It was a small, boxy structure with faded lettering on the door that read Veteran Outreach Center. To anyone else, it was just another underfunded office offering help to struggling service members. To me, it was a gateway to the kind of support no one in my former life could understand. I knocked twice and waited. A few moments later, the door creaked open to reveal Sarah Torres. Sarah was one of those people who could make you feel like you were standing at attention just by looking at you. Compact, sharp-eyed, and efficient, she'd spent years in military intelligence before retiring and dedicating her life to helping veterans navigate civilian battles. I hadn't spoken to her since my deployment, but if anyone could help me piece this mess together, it was Sarah. "Alex," she said, her expression unreadable. "I heard you were back. What's going on?" I motioned to Liam, who was hanging back, unsure of this new environment. "A lot," I said, my voice grim. "Can we talk inside?" She nodded and stepped aside, her sharp eyes briefly softening as they landed on Liam. "Come on in, kid. You look like you could use a snack." Inside, the office was cluttered but comfortable, with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of coffee. Liam settled onto a couch with a juice box Sarah handed him, and I leaned against the desk, gathering my thoughts. "Spill it," Sarah said, folding her arms. "You've got that look like you just walked into an ambush." I told her everything. The silence from Elena during my last weeks of deployment. The changes to the house. The bombshell Liam had dropped about the wedding. The betrayal I'd walked into at the church. By the time I finished, Sarah's jaw was tight and her eyes were blazing. "Mark Weston?" she said, practically spitting the name. "That smug son of a—" I raised a hand to stop her. "Yeah, him. And it's not just him. My parents, my sister, Elena, they're all in on it. They erased me, Sarah. They rewrote our lives while I was halfway around the world." Sarah didn't ask the obvious questions. She knew better. Instead, she nodded and grabbed a notebook from her desk. "All right, here's what we do. First, we gather intel. You don't make a move without knowing who your real enemies are, what resources they're working with, and what skeletons they're hiding in their closets." I nodded. This was why I'd come to her. I wasn't just angry. I was strategic. "Mark's got a lot to lose," Sarah continued. "If he's been moving in on Elena, he's probably made some mistakes. People like him always do. I'll start digging into his financials, business dealings, personal life. Same for Elena." "What about my parents?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "They financed this wedding. They helped him." "Then they're complicit," Sarah said bluntly. "But we start with the weakest link. Someone in that group knows something they don't want you to find out. We find them and we apply pressure. And if they don't crack, they will," Sarah said confidently. "People like them always do. They're not built for this kind of fight." I glanced over at Liam, who was focused on his juice box but clearly listening. He looked so small, so out of place in this world of strategies and counterattacks. But he was watching, learning. "Liam," I said gently, "why don't you explore the library in the back? There are some books and games there. I need to talk to Sarah for a minute." He hesitated but nodded, walking off with his shoulders just a little too stiff. Sarah waited until he was out of earshot. "How's he holding up?" "He's strong," I said. "Too strong for his age. He doesn't deserve any of this." "No, he doesn't," Sarah agreed, "which is why we're going to make sure you win this." For the next hour, we mapped out a plan. Sarah pulled up some preliminary records on her laptop, publicly available information that hinted at deeper secrets. Mark's company had inconsistencies in its tax filings. Elena had made several large withdrawals from our joint account. My parents had transferred money to an unlisted account around the same time I'd stopped hearing from them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time I left the office, my head was spinning with possibilities. Liam climbed into the car without a word, and I could feel the weight of his unspoken questions. "Dad," he said finally as I started the engine. "Is Miss Sarah going to help us?" "She already is," I said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "But this is going to take time, buddy. We're not just fighting to win. We're fighting to make sure they never hurt us again." He nodded solemnly, his little face set with determination. "Like a mission?" "Exactly," I said. "And I don't lose missions." As we drove away, I felt the first flicker of hope since stepping off that plane. This wasn't just a fight for revenge, it was a fight for justice. And I wasn't fighting alone. The days following that first meeting with Sarah felt like gearing up for deployment all over again. The difference was, this time, the battlefield wasn't overseas. It was my life. And the enemy wasn't hiding in shadows. They were people I knew, People I had once trusted. People who had no idea the war they had just invited. Sarah worked fast. Within 48 hours, she had compiled a preliminary dossier that painted a much clearer picture of the web of betrayal. She handed me the folder in her no-nonsense way, and I opened it with a mix of dread and determination. Mark Weston's finances were a mess. For all his charm and polished demeanor, he'd made some serious missteps in his business dealings. There were discrepancies in his company's tax filings, inflated projections to investors, and whispers of corner-cutting in contracts. He wasn't just morally bankrupt. He was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Then there was Elena, my wife. Or at least, the woman who used to be. Sarah had traced several suspicious transactions back to her. A string of withdrawals from our joint savings account, always just under the limit that would trigger a bank's scrutiny. The money had been funneled into what looked like personal expenses. A new wardrobe, expensive dinners, even a payment for a private getaway to a resort I'd never heard of. My parents weren't any better. They'd transferred money to Mark's account months before I returned, under the guise of family investments. My sister, Lucy, had been just as complicit, acting as a go-between for Mark and Elena when they needed to cover their tracks. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a full-blown conspiracy. And I was the casualty they'd written off without hesitation. "So, what's the plan?" I asked Sarah, leaning forward as we pored over the evidence in her cramped office. She smirked, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to regret crossing her. "We apply pressure, one piece at a time. People like Mark and Elena, they're used to controlling the narrative. We're going to take that away from them." I liked the sound of that. Step 1. Hit Mark where it hurts. The first strike came in the form of an anonymous tip to his largest investor. Sarah's contact in the financial world forwarded documentation of Mark's shady dealings. Nothing too damning yet, just enough to make them pause and start asking questions. Within days, Mark's business partners were scrambling, pulling out of deals and freezing accounts. I could almost picture his face when the calls started rolling in. Step 2. Isolate Elena. Sarah discovered that Elena had been using her teaching career as a shield, painting herself as a hard-working, devoted mother abandoned by a cold-hearted soldier. The truth, of course, was far less flattering. Sarah dug into her employment records and found several complaints buried deep in her file. Parents unhappy with her professionalism, colleagues raising concerns about her behavior. Nothing major on its own, but when laid out in a detailed report, it painted a picture of someone unfit for the pedestal she had placed herself on. We sent that report anonymously to the school board. The result? A formal review of her position. Step 3. Expose the family's complicity. I had to force myself not to let emotions take over when it came to my parents. The betrayal still stung in ways I couldn't put into words, but I channeled that hurt into focus. Sarah found evidence of their financial involvement in Mark and Elena's wedding plans, along with email threads discussing how to handle my potential return. The emails made my blood boil. My father's calculated tone, my mother's rationalizations, Lucy's casual disregard, it was all there in black and white. They weren't just passive participants. They'd planned this, step by step. We compiled the evidence into a neat package and forwarded it to their closest friends and business associates. Anonymously, of course. It wasn't long before their phone calls to me started. I didn't answer. Step 4. Stay one step ahead. This wasn't just about striking back. It was about staying in control. Sarah and I spent hours each night mapping out every move, anticipating their responses and planning countermeasures. She taught me how to think like them, how to predict their next steps. Elena tried to regain control by spinning her story to mutual friends. Mark attempted to stabilize his business by reaching out to new investors. My parents began damage control, hosting dinners and meetings to salvage their reputations. Each time they moved, we hit back harder. The first real crack came when Mark's assistant quit, citing harassment allegations. Sarah had uncovered the complaints and ensured they reached the right ears. Without her, Mark's company began to crumble faster than he could patch the holes. Then came the school board's decision to place Elena on administrative leave. Public whispers about her personal life made her a liability they couldn't ignore. My parents lost their footing next. Invitations to social events dried up, their friends distancing themselves from the growing scandal. Even Lucy found herself on the receiving end of cold shoulders and polite rejections. Step 5. Protect Liam. Through it all, Liam was my anchor. I made sure he was shielded from the fallout as much as possible. When he asked questions, I answered honestly, but gently. I wanted him to see that justice wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about consequences. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, he turned to me and said, "You're fighting for us, aren't you, Dad?" I nodded, ruffling his hair. "Always, buddy, always." The first phase of our counterattack was complete. The pieces were falling into place, but this was just the beginning. The war was far from over, and I was ready for whatever came next, because if they thought I'd let them destroy my life and walk away unscathed, they were sorely mistaken. The day the legal papers arrived felt like a fresh ambush. They were delivered by courier, neatly sealed in a manila envelope bearing the name of Elena's lawyer. I knew what they were before I even opened it. Custody. The document was thick with legal jargon, but the essence was simple. Elena and Mark were filing for full custody of Liam. Their argument? I was an unstable veteran, consumed by anger and unfit to provide a stable home environment. I sat at the kitchen table, reading every line with a growing sense of disbelief. The audacity was staggering. The words painted a picture of me as a danger to my own son. A man consumed by the horrors of war, unable to distinguish reality from paranoia. I closed the folder and set it on the table, staring at it like it might bite. For a moment, anger boiled under my skin, but then Liam's voice drifted in from the living room. He was humming to himself, building some Lego structure on the coffee table, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. I wouldn't let them take him. Not now, not ever. The first call I made was to Sarah. "This isn't just a battle," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's war now." Sarah, calm as ever, responded without missing a beat. "Then let's make sure you're ready. Send me the papers, and I'll start digging. You're not fighting this alone, Alex." It was the first time I allowed myself to feel a flicker of relief. Within days, Sarah had put together a counteroffensive that would make any general proud. First, she introduced me to Maria Gonzalez, a family law attorney with a reputation for being as sharp as a scalpel. Maria was a force of nature, the kind of lawyer who could smile while tearing an opponent's argument apart. She reviewed the custody filing, her expression growing darker with each page. "They're trying to weaponize your military service against you," she said, her voice tight with anger. "It's disgusting, but not unexpected. The good news is, we have the truth on our side, and we're going to use it." She explained our strategy. It wasn't just about defending me, it was about exposing them, their manipulations, their lies, their attempts to alienate Liam from me. Everything they'd done would be laid bare in court. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Sarah worked her magic, gathering evidence that painted a very different picture from the one Elena and Mark were trying to sell. First, we collected character witnesses, fellow soldiers, commanding officers, even military psychologists, all willing to testify to my stability and character. Colonel Davidson, my former CO, was particularly emphatic in his support. "Major Reed is one of the most disciplined and level-headed officers I've ever had the privilege of commanding," he said in his written statement. "The idea that he's unstable is not just false, it's insulting to his service." Then there was the documentation. Sarah had recordings of Elena and Mark coaching Liam to lie about me, whispering poison into his ear when they thought he was asleep. We had financial records showing their misuse of joint funds, their attempts to paint me as absent while they spent my money. Sarah even tracked down emails between Elena and Mark, discussing strategies to undermine me in court. They were damning, to say the least. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with my head held high. Maria was at my side, her briefcase packed with evidence that could sink a ship. Liam stayed close to me, his small hand gripping mine tightly. Elena and Mark were already seated, their lawyer exuding confidence. But the confidence started to crack the moment Maria began her opening argument. She dismantled their claims piece by piece. "Let's talk about this so-called unstable behavior," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "Here are Major Reed's psychological evaluations, all of which show exemplary mental health. And here are recordings of Mrs. Reed and Mr. Weston coaching Liam to lie about his father." The room fell silent as the recordings played, Elena's voice unmistakable as she whispered instructions to Liam. "Just say Daddy scares you sometimes, that he gets angry a lot. It's for the best, honey." Elena's face paled, her lawyer scrambling to recover. But it was too late. Maria continued her assault, presenting financial records, character testimonies, and even Liam's schoolwork, which included essays about how much he missed his dad. The most powerful moment came when Liam took the stand. He was nervous at first, but as he looked at me for reassurance, his confidence grew. "They told me to lie about my dad," he said clearly. "But my dad's a hero. He loves me and he protects me. He's the best dad in the world." Elena burst into tears, Mark muttering under his breath as the judge silenced them with a sharp look. When the judge finally spoke, their words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Major Reed has demonstrated not only his fitness as a parent, but his unwavering commitment to his son's well-being. Full custody is granted to Major Reed. Mrs. Reed's visitation will be supervised, and her attempts to manipulate her child will be noted in all future proceedings. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Liam ran to me, wrapping his arms around my waist as tears pricked my eyes. Walking out victorious. As we left the courtroom, Elena tried to approach, her face streaked with tears. "Alex, please," she begged. "We can work this out." I turned to her, my voice cold. "You already made your choice, Elena. Now you'll live with it." Liam squeezed my hand as we walked out into the sunlight. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally free. This battle was over. But the war? That was far from finished. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout to begin. Once the custody battle concluded, I knew it was time to go on the offensive. The courtroom victory was just one piece of the puzzle. Justice needed to extend beyond legal boundaries. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, loud, and everywhere. That's where Mia Collins came in. Mia was a journalist with a reputation for exposing the kind of dirty secrets that ruined reputations and careers. We met late one evening at Sarah's office, her notepad already filled with scribbled questions before I even walked in the door. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's get to it, Major Reed," she said, her pen poised. "You've got a hell of a story. Let's make sure we tell it right." And so, I told her everything. The betrayal, the lies, the custody battle. I handed over documents, recordings, financial statements, everything Sarah and I had compiled over the past few months. Mia listened intently, her eyes narrowing as the pieces fell into place. "They really thought they'd get away with this," she muttered, flipping through the evidence. "They didn't count on me coming back," I replied. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "No, they didn't. But they're about to learn why they shouldn't have underestimated you." 2 weeks later, the article hit the front page of the local newspaper. The headline was brutal and left no room for misinterpretation. "Betrayed on the battlefield. A soldier's fight for justice against family and friends." The story was relentless. Mia didn't just write about the betrayal. She painted a vivid picture of what it meant for a deployed soldier to fight for his country while his family conspired against him. She detailed Mark Weston's fraudulent business practices, Elena's financial misdeeds, and my parents' complicity in the entire scheme. She quoted Colonel Davidson's testimony, outlined the custody battle, and even included excerpts from Liam's school essays about missing his dad. But the real blow came in the form of the photos. There was Elena in a wedding dress, standing beside Mark at the altar. My parents and sister sat in the front row, smiling, celebrating the union of betrayal. Juxtaposed with these were images of me in combat zones, surrounded by fellow soldiers, living through conditions they couldn't even begin to imagine. The contrast was damning. The impact was almost immediate. Within hours, the article went viral. Social media exploded with outrage. Military groups shared the story widely, condemning the actions of Elena, Mark, and my family. Comments flooded the newspaper's website, some from veterans who'd experienced similar betrayals, others from civilians horrified by the audacity of it all. The veterans community rallied behind me. Support poured in from people I didn't even know. Fellow soldiers, their families, even civilians who understood the sacrifices we made. Mark, Elena, and my parents, on the other hand, became pariahs almost overnight. Mark's business partners started pulling out of deals. Investors demanded explanations. Within days, his company's stock plummeted, and he was forced to step down as CEO. Elena's school board placed her on indefinite leave, citing the controversy as a distraction. Parents of her students demanded her removal, calling her a disgrace. As for my parents, their social circle evaporated. Their friends, who once celebrated their status, now shunned them, unwilling to associate with the scandal. My sister, Lucy, faced similar rejection, her reputation as a trusted real estate agent in ruins. The first call came from my mother. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "This has gone too far." "You made your choice, remember?" I replied coldly. "Now you're dealing with the consequences." She started to cry, but I didn't feel any sympathy. It was too late for that. Mark called next. His tone was angrier, more desperate. "You've destroyed everything, Alex. My business, my reputation." "I didn't destroy anything," I interrupted. "You did that yourself the moment you betrayed me." Elena's message was the most pitiful. She left a voicemail, her voice cracking with emotion. "Alex, please. We can fix this, for Liam's sake." I deleted it without listening to the rest. What they didn't understand, what they refused to accept, was that this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring the truth came out. They had spent months, maybe years, rewriting the narrative, erasing me from my own life. Now I had taken the pen back. Mia's article didn't just expose their actions. It forced them to confront the reality of what they'd done. Their lies couldn't hold up under the weight of public scrutiny. And Liam? He saw everything. He watched as the world rallied behind us, as people recognized the truth of what had happened. It gave him something I couldn't put into words: vindication. One evening, as we sat on the couch, he turned to me and said, "They can't hurt us anymore, can they?" "No," I said, pulling him close. "They can't." The fallout continued for weeks. Every time Elena, Mark, or my parents tried to rebuild, another wave of the story surfaced. Veterans groups showed up at public events where Mark tried to save face, sharing loud conversations about loyalty and betrayal. Elena's attempts to paint herself as a victim were drowned out by her own actions, laid bare for the world to see. And my parents? They were left to stew in their silence, their carefully curated lives crumbling into irrelevance. This wasn't just a victory. It was a message. To them, to anyone who thought betrayal came without consequences. This was justice. I've often heard people say, "Karma always catches up to you." Watching the fallout of my enemies' choices unfold in real time, I realized karma wasn't just catching up, it was steamrolling them. Every decision they'd made, every lie they'd told, and every betrayal they'd orchestrated came crashing back on them like a tidal wave they couldn't outrun. The first to fall was Mark. His business empire, already cracking under the weight of public scrutiny after Mia's article, came crashing down in spectacular fashion. Anonymous tips, courtesy of Sarah's impeccable intelligence work, revealed fraudulent contracts, falsified tax filings, and misappropriation of funds. Within a week, the SEC launched an investigation. By the second week, Mark's company had been delisted from the stock exchange. Investors pulled out faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. Mark tried to keep up appearances, but the stress was visible. The last surveillance footage Sarah sent me showed him pacing outside his office building, sweat soaking through his tailored suit as he barked into his phone. He looked less like the confident charmer I'd once trusted, and more like a man on the verge of collapse. Then came the lawsuits. One by one, former partners and clients turned on him, filing claims for losses incurred due to his fraudulent practices. His legal bills piled up faster than he could pay them. His once polished image as a successful entrepreneur was shattered, replaced by headlines branding him a con artist. The final blow came when his assistant quit, citing a hostile work environment. Her resignation was accompanied by a formal complaint, which prompted a deeper HR investigation. By the time it was over, Mark wasn't just a financial pariah. He was toxic. Elena didn't fare any better. Mia's article had been brutal, but what came next was worse. Parents at her school, already uneasy after the revelations, started digging into her past. Within days, complaints about her unprofessional behavior resurfaced. Moments she'd dismissed as inconsequential now carried the weight of public opinion. The school board placed her on administrative leave, but that wasn't enough for the outraged parents. The whispers grew louder, turning into demands. A petition circulated, calling for her permanent removal. I stayed out of it. I didn't need to add fuel to the fire. The truth was doing all the work for me. The final straw came when a local veterans group caught wind of the story. They organized protests outside the school, holding signs that read, "Betrayal has consequences," and "Support soldiers, not their betrayers." Elena resigned the next day. But her downfall didn't stop there. The joint account withdrawals Sarah had uncovered weren't just suspicious, they were potentially illegal. When my lawyer Maria filed for financial restitution during the divorce proceedings, Elena had no way to justify her actions. The court ordered her to repay every cent she'd taken, leaving her drowning in debt. Her social life evaporated overnight. Friends she'd relied on for support distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her scandal. By the end of the month, Elena had moved out of town, retreating to a small apartment in a place where no one knew her name or her story. My parents and sister had thought they could weather the storm, but they underestimated the power of exposure. Their role in the betrayal was undeniable, documented in emails, financial transactions, and even photographs. Sarah made sure their involvement reached the right people: business associates, country club friends, and community leaders. It didn't take long for the invitations to dry up. My father's business partners, already wary of guilt by association, forced him into early retirement. His carefully curated reputation as a shrewd and reliable businessman was replaced by whispered conversations about his unethical behavior. My mother's social standing, once her pride and joy, disintegrated. Every charity board and committee she'd chaired asked for her resignation. Her friends, unwilling to risk their own reputations, cut ties without hesitation. Lucy, my sister, faced the harshest consequences. Her real estate career was built on trust that evaporated the moment her role in the betrayal became public knowledge. Clients canceled contracts, her license was suspended, and she found herself facing financial ruin. Her marriage didn't survive the fallout. Her husband, furious at the financial and social repercussions of her actions, filed for divorce. The most satisfying part of their ruin wasn't watching them fall. It was knowing they had done it to themselves. I hadn't lifted a finger to fabricate evidence or twist the truth. Everything they suffered was the direct result of their own actions, laid bare for the world to see. Mark lived in a cramped apartment by the end of it, working a menial job to scrape by. Elena tried to rebuild her life in another state, but whispers of her past followed her wherever she went. My parents retreated to their vacation home, but even there, they couldn't escape the stigma. Lucy, once so smug in her position, ended up working a retail job just to keep the lights on. As for me, I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, just relief. Relief that Liam and I could finally move forward, free from their manipulations. One night, as Liam and I played a game of chess at the kitchen table, he looked up at me and asked, "Dad, why did they do it? Why did they hurt us?" I paused, considering my words carefully. Sometimes, buddy, people let their selfishness get the better of them. They think they can take shortcuts and not pay for them, but life doesn't work that way. He nodded solemnly, then moved his knight to check my king. Well, they lost. I smiled, ruffling his hair. Yeah, they did. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring they could never hurt us again. The truth had been their undoing. And Liam and I, we were finally free. Rebuilding a life after betrayal is like rebuilding a house after a storm. It's messy, slow, and requires a solid foundation. The victories in court and the fallout from exposing the truth were just the beginning. Liam and I still had to pick up the pieces of what had been shattered. The first few weeks in our new rental home were strange. The walls were bare, the rooms too quiet, and the air carried a weight I couldn't shake. But as I sat on the couch one evening, watching Liam quietly stack his Legos, I realized the only way forward was to rebuild. Not just a home, but a life. Liam needed consistency. He needed to know that no matter what happened, I was there for him. Every morning I made breakfast, burnt toast and scrambled eggs at first, but I got better. I walked him to the bus stop, something I'd never done before deployments. When he got home, I was there, asking about his day, helping with homework, and playing catch in the yard. One night, as we sat on the floor assembling a new bookshelf, Liam looked up and said, "It's nice having you home, Dad. For real this time." I paused, the screwdriver in my hand, and gave him a small smile. "It's nice being home, buddy. For real this time." Those moments became the foundation of our new life. While Liam adjusted quickly, I had my own battles to fight. There were nights I'd lie awake, replaying every betrayal in my head. My parents, my sister, Elena, Mark. Their faces haunted me, their words echoing in my mind. One night, I found myself staring at the phone, debating whether to call my mother. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand answers. The other part wanted to close that chapter forever. I chose the latter. Instead of focusing on the past, I threw myself into creating a future for Liam and me. I started a consulting firm with Sarah, Reed Security Solutions, specializing in helping veterans transition into civilian life while teaching companies about loyalty and ethics. It felt good to work with people I trusted, building something that mattered. Liam had questions, lots of them. Why did Mom and Uncle Mark do what they did? Why didn't Grandma and Grandpa stop them? Why did people hurt others? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing. I wanted Liam to grow up understanding the importance of honor and integrity. We had long talks over dinner, playing chess, or while walking the dog we'd adopted, his idea, of course. I told him stories about my time in the military, about the men and women who'd stood beside me, about the sacrifices we made for each other. Loyalty matters, buddy, I'd say. It's what makes us strong, what makes us good. I won't be like them, he replied one evening. I promise, Dad. And I believed him. As the months turned into years, Liam thrived. He grew stronger, more confident, and more determined. He joined the soccer team, aced his classes, and even started helping me with small tasks for the consulting firm. One day, he came home from school with an assignment to write about someone who inspired him. He chose me. I wrote about how you fought for me, Dad, he said, handing me the paper. Not just in court, but here. Every day. I didn't have words. I just pulled him into a hug, my chest tight with emotion. 5 years later, Liam and I stood in the crowd at the military academy graduation. He was 13 now, tall for his age, and carried himself with a confidence that made me proud. I'd been invited to speak to the graduating cadets, sharing lessons about loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. As I stepped onto the stage, I saw Liam sitting between Sarah and Jessica, my now wife, a military widow who understood the sacrifices we'd made. Honor, I began, isn't just a word, it's a choice. It's the foundation of who we are and what we do. You'll be tested, on the battlefield and in life. And when that happens, remember this: your choices define you, and the consequences of those choices follow you forever. The cadets nodded, their faces filled with determination. And in the audience, Liam's eyes shone with pride. That evening, as we returned home, Liam asked, "Do you think they regret it? What they did to us?" I thought about it for a moment. "Probably," I said, "but their regret isn't what matters. What matters is that we didn't let it break us. We built something stronger." He smiled, nodding. "Yeah, we did." As the sun set outside, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Liam was happy. Our life was stable. And the people who had tried to destroy us were living with the consequences of their choices. We didn't just rebuild our lives. We built a legacy. One founded on honor, resilience, and the unshakable bond between a father and his son. And as I watched Liam laughing with Jessica in the kitchen, I knew we had something they could never take away. A future filled with hope, strength, and truth. For the first time in a long time, I felt free.